And what we're going to do right now is have a bit of a conversation with two of our national commissioners that really takes a look at where we are in this national commission process and some of where we're hoping to go. This session, entitled Reshaping America's Innovation Agenda, as I said, is going to really set the stage for what we are calling phase 2 of the National Commission's work. Over 18 months ago at the Council on Competitiveness's National Competitiveness Forum, we released the report, Competing in the Next Economy. This is the report that Deborah referenced earlier that laid out the challenges and the opportunities for the US innovation agenda and its capabilities and capacities. As she noted, it called for a 10 times increase in our innovation capacity. That was an increase in productivity, economic growth, prosperity for all citizens. There were 50 individual recommendations. I will not be going through each one with you today. But in total, those recommendations sought to strengthen US leadership, elevate the national innovation agenda, increase R&D investments, make better use of those R&D investments that we were already making, close our digital divide, and deploy a new US technology statecraft. Since releasing those recommendations, we have been working very closely with government leaders, private sector leaders, university leaders, to try and get their embracing of these recommendations, both within their respective organizations, but also to be agents of change and advocates for us. And we have made tremendous progress. So where we stand today is the opportunity to take stock of what we have done to date, but also to launch ourselves into phase 2 of this effort. And we do this well understanding just how different the world is today than it was when we released the report just a little year and a half or so ago. Some examples. Long-term trends that were already in place around digitization, teleworking, and telelearning have accelerated tremendously. The workforce, as we've already heard here today, is completely reorganizing and changing. Many people are moving from the urban centers they may have lived and worked to exurbs, to rural areas, to suburbs, and finding they're able to do the job just as well, if not better than they used to. Since 2020, US business formation has grown tremendously. The energy picture, as again, we've talked already today, is wildly different than it was just a couple of years ago. And really, the pandemic was a rude awakening for the US as just to how sensitive and non-resilient our supply chains were, and something that needs to be addressed tremendously. So, our agenda, the Commission's agenda, going forward into phase 2 is going to be focused in 4 areas. And these are going to be areas that are going to come up as we're in our working groups and talking about recommendations of where we go from here. These 4 areas are the transition to clean energy, accelerating the development and deployment of critical technologies, the future of work, and the future of place-based innovation, which we just heard so much about. Now, I know there's a lot to talk about here. We're going to really dive into it in our working groups in about a half hour or so. But first, I'm so thrilled to be joined by Josh Parker and Steve Stavanovich, 2 tremendous leaders, 2 commissioners, to talk a little bit about where we go from here with the commission and some of the issues that I hope will set the stage for your discussions coming up. Josh Parker is the Chief Executive Officer of Ancora. Steve Stevanovich is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of SGS Global Holdings. Their full bios are in your materials, and I commend you to read them. But gentlemen, first of all, thank you for joining me up here. Thank you for listening to the monologue for the last couple of minutes. And I just want to start off with a sort of a big picture question, which is a key recommendation of the Commission's report was really a call for just greater leadership and attention to the need to boost US innovation and competitiveness. Do you have a sense that that sort of call to action has been heard by leaders in Washington and in the states around the country? Josh, want to start?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Bill. Yeah, I think it is being heard, and what exciting remarks from Erwin. And I think that's testament to it being heard. We're seeing it heard in some of the political spheres. I mean, you see Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer are sort of getting back to the table to deal with some real issues around energy, although I think it's probably going to be 5 cents on a $5 problem, but they are trying to make some headway there. Senator Young and pushing the USICA. So I think we're seeing bipartisan political leadership, and so it's good to know that the issues that we're focused on are attracting bipartisan support in a hyper-partisan environment. I think that what Erwin sort of alluded to, sort of the front door concept, I think John brought this up too, just sort of how folks are able to engage with their government is improving. And I think, they've heard that if we want to drive innovation, we need to lower barriers to entry and provide opportunities for small and medium-sized business to engage with the tremendous resources that we have. I think there's still an opportunity for states to show a little more leadership. I think we still have states that are focused on competing with each other as opposed to being competitive in a global economy. And then I think we're seeing great leadership out of universities, particularly state universities, and moving the academy to full appreciation of translation and commercialization as a respectable path for career and tenure and whatnot. Although I think there are some warning signs. I mean, what we saw recently in Madison, where sort of critical thinking and academic freedom and appreciation for science being under attack is something that we've got to be cautious about, because nothing stifles innovation like attacking that type of thinking.
And I would agree with all of that. And the one thing that I wanted to add is that I think one thing that's helping in Washington as far as doing the right things is the fact that you're seeing all of these regional, state, university, and so forth organizations. For example, here, just looking at all the people from Wyoming that are involved in innovation and entrepreneurship and so forth. And then, for example, I'm very involved with the University of Chicago, and there the university had historically, like most universities, had an issue where professors would work on something, they'd spend a year and a half using some grant money, they'd invent something, the university would basically patent it, and then what would happen with that patent? Nothing. The professor would think of something else they'd want to work on, they'd publish on the first issue, spend another year and a half, and so forth. And in the university's case, for example, the first thing it tried to do is set up something called UTech a bunch of years ago. And it basically got a couple of Silicon Valley guys involved, and they would basically go to venture capital funds to try to sell the patents. Of course, that didn't work because venture capital funds aren't in the business of buying patents. They're in the business of buying companies and investing in companies. And so that's where the university then set up its own accelerator, which is called the Polsky Center. And that actually has been extremely helpful. And the university, for example, just in the last fiscal year, launched 135 new companies. But the university has dozens of groups that are basically out there trying to do the, sort of similar things. And then, of course, you have other universities in the Chicago area, like Northwestern University of Illinois. You have state organizations, you have City of Chicago organizations. So one of the things that I think happens is all of these regional local organizations are also reaching out to the federal government. And so the federal government also has a lot of places to plug into as well. And so one of the things that we're definitely seeing is that as these organizations sort of feed on each other as well, you're getting sort of exponential growth in that sector. And I think that's helping the federal government focus on it, despite, sort of the Republican and Democrat side of things.
Steve, but do you feel like there's a more sympathetic ear from both the state leadership and the federal level?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So and along those same lines, Erwin talked about the legislation in front of Congress right now in both the House and the Senate. They're trying to work out the differences, which we could, that who knows how long that may take. But let's for the sake of optimism, assume that they do work out the differences, and in legislation that includes the authorization for TIP, it includes big increases in R&D. Is that enough? Is that sort of, if that happens, should Congress sort of pat itself on the back and say mission accomplished? Or do you feel like this is a first step that needs more? Or is there a key piece of this whole conversation that you feel might be lacking?
I definitely think it's only a first step. My funds basically focus on what we've described as the valley of death. And it's not that easy to go from development and investing in development to actually getting things into the market. And the problem is it's not just a money issue. Throwing more money into a company that's not capable of getting a product into the market doesn't do anything. And there are a number of different things that we see that are an issue. It could be everything from the person who is heading that company, maybe is a good inventor and knows his science, but bringing something to market is a whole different skill set. This is where, for example, many venture capital firms and coming in can help in that process and can help bring in people who know what they're doing to commercialize a product. Sometimes that's difficult to do simply because the founder of the company doesn't want to let go or admit that they have issues moving forward. But there is definitely, it's not just throwing money at it, it's also helping with the process.
Yeah, I'd put it squarely in the category of good start. We've talked about the target of 2 to 3% of GDP being where we should target research spending, and we're still well short of that. The thing that's fascinating to me is, how we sort of take things for granted as though they always existed. But this sort of amazing partnership between the federal government, universities, national labs is not that old. I mean, this is a convention post World War II that really allowed for dollars collected at the federal government level to flow down to very smart people working on very important challenges. And I think we sort of just assume that happens and that works, but we don't think about how to iterate it and how to grow it and keep investing in it. And so I think we've got to keep the pressure up on Congress, because you can look globally and there is no better system for driving innovation than that partnership between the federal government, universities, and national labs. I mean, it's efficient. It's got demonstrable outcomes, trillions of dollars worth of economic value created over that time period. And so when Congress thinks about allocating dollars and investing in programs, and trying to drive outcomes, you can look at whether it's tax policy or spending plans, whatever, you're not going to find anything more efficient or more effective than that partnership. So I think we've got to continue telling that story and sort of remind folks in Congress that it's incumbent upon them to keep those investments going in order to continue driving those outcomes. I think there's also opportunities to look at that model, though, and try to innovate it itself. We do a very poor job of leveraging private capital out of that system, which is part of what contributes to the valley of death, is we just sort of don't connect what happens, for things that are successful with, basic science. And SBIR program, tries to get at that by really forcing things out in order for those grants to be most competitive. But I think the way that we leverage private capital, the way we can think about co-location opportunities that really bring entrepreneurs and industry participants as close to physically and programmatically with universities and with national labs is important. That lowering that barrier to entry for engagement is important. I think there's an opportunity for us to re-examine indirect cost models and really think about, we're using a system created in the 80s to think about how those funds should be allocated and how universities and national labs and others are able to spend those dollars. And so all of that should be on the table. The last thing I think is, the national lab program is very, very efficient. One of the things that it really provides is access to core facilities. And so I think our ability to expand our core facilities infrastructure across the country could be quite important to how we think about accessing greater innovation opportunities going forward.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate you describing the legislation as a good start, because I think the important thing to remember here, and Erwin talked about it in his talk about the I want to say $2 billion that they're hoping to have authorized and approach. It really is an authorization bill that's being talked about in Congress right now. So there has to be follow through. We've done this before where we've authorized a lot of extra money for research and haven't never seen it materialize. So, those of you that advocate for these sorts of things and think it's important, I just, caution you to not let up. It's hopefully this will get across the finish line, because so many of the recommendations in this legislation are so consistent with what the commission was advocating for, and we hope to see it, but it really is the start. So let's switch, and I want to get your opinions on one of the topics that Erwin talked a lot about, which is the regional issue and expanding the pie to outside of the typical players here. Are you seeing that happening? I mean, obviously you talked a lot about the engines and some of the different areas, and then maybe even doubling back a little bit to a question Deborah asked earlier. Are you seeing any barriers to that happening that concern you going forward? You want to go first this time?
Yeah, I'll tee that up since it's squarely in your business, but I think look, there's nothing like sort of exigent circumstance for unforeseen events that help create change. And so COVID has really changed the dynamics dramatically in terms of where talent is located, where talent, the mobility of talent, the porosity of talent, and where funding is. So, for a long time, we've all noticed that venture funding is concentrated on the coast and in a couple of markets. And if interesting innovations were happening, the venture capitalists would say, if you want this money, move here so that we can keep a close eye on you and you can be close to a big pool of talent for executive talent, scientific talent, whatever. I think what we've seen really be accelerated over the past couple of years is the technology is now allowing for that type of monitoring effect to happen remotely. And so we're seeing more venture investment happening in secondary and tertiary places where the talent is willing to move. So the CFO, the CEO, the COO who were rooted in Boston or San Francisco are now willing to move to Columbus or to Durham and think about growing those companies there, and the funding is moving there. The venture partners don't have to worry about getting on a plane. They're already working from their summer home, and so they'll just video in and see how things are going. So I think that's important. The other thing that we've seen just here recently, and this is a cyclical issue, but valuations have run up so substantially in the large markets that I think you're going to see this latest vintage of funds being some of the worst performers in at least a generation, because valuations got so out ahead of where real value was being created. And so the capital was just not being deployed efficiently in the large markets. And so the venture capitalists started to realize that we can invest in similar technologies and do that in smaller markets where the dollars go further, where the expectations for valuation are not quite as high. And then I think we're seeing sort of, in addition to the talent pools that are distributed, we're seeing different modalities of technology that allow for distribution. So cell and gene therapy is a great example where, from bench to clinic really wants to be in one place where you've got full control. And some of that has to do with the approval process, but the ability to, make an intervention, take that into a bioreactor, put that in the cryo, take it to the clinic, see what the outcome is, and then take that right back. And have that all happen in one location is very important. And you can't really outsource that. It's not like biotech and making pharmaceutical drugs. You can't, ship that to Mexico or to China. That has to happen right there where the clinic is because of the way that technology works. So I think we're going to see more technologies like that that have real place-specific attributes.
And I agree, COVID has definitely helped sort of reshape people's thinking about working remotely. My daughter, who just graduated, she wanted to work from Florida, where she was born, and she just got a job with a Silicon Valley startup that's based in Silicon Valley. and she'll be working only remotely from Florida. And one of the other things that I think that remote work obviously helps other regions for that reason. But the other thing that I think it also helps change is that historically, venture capital firms, for example, the big investments were in software and biotech. But there are three things now that have started to sort of push that into other industries more and more. One is that there have been some very successful examples in other industries, for example, Tesla. And so all of a sudden you saw a lot of money go into electric vehicle companies, if you will. The other thing is obviously the push for climate change, which has gotten a lot of investors obviously interested in investing in clean technologies and so on and so forth. But the third thing is, for example, Chicago, for example, becoming more of a, having more of an infrastructure for bringing new companies out, because it's traditionally a place that has manufacturing and industry. The kinds of companies that, you know, sort of come out of that tend to be a little bit different in the kind of companies that might be coming out of a Silicon Valley environment as well. So I think that's all sort of affecting it.
Let me get your perspectives on an issue. Josh, you both have talked about some large dollars in the venture role and the money they're putting in. The federal government is talking about making some massive investments of its own right now. We heard earlier about the hydrogen hubs and other projects like that. Again, back to the USICA bill, if there's $52 billion in CHIPS money that's being thrown about. How does the private sector viewing that? Is that a good thing? Are you concerned about competition? We have this little thing about inflation that some people have heard about recently. Are you worried about it? Are you happy about it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think to the extent that someone is already an investor in a company that's going to get now additional government money, they can see that as a subsidy and they'll probably be very happy about it. I think, however, that one of the concerns obviously is the government doesn't necessarily have a great track record of picking winners and losers in particular industries. You know, Solyndra is one example, obviously. And so one of the concerns that I would have is how that money is allocated and which companies in this particular industry one is going to choose. And that's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, spot on. If you think about private investment, what it values more than anything is predictability, where it can find it. And so when you think about federal, state, or local programs that are coming into place, the private sector wants to know exactly how that's going to work, exactly how those dollars are going to flow, exactly what they're intended to support, and exactly what they're going to have to demonstrate as a successful outcome. And so any of those programs that are being considered, I think first and foremost, they've got to think about how they can demonstrate predictability so that the private sector knows how to interface. I think that point you make about picking winners and losers is spot on. I think of it in terms of, the traditional government programs like to make awards as opposed to co-invest for outcomes. And so I think trying to shift some of that thinking away from, we have a program and you're going to submit an application and then we're going to tell you if your application meets our criteria. Programs like tax credit programs, for example, renewable energy tax credits, historic preservation tax credits, new markets tax credits, that give you a set of criteria for an investment that qualifies, and then let you claim that based on demonstrating that you meet the criteria of that investment, allow for that predictability and drive capital into those desired outcomes. So I'm always a little bit suspect about sort of the making awards, framework, as opposed to trying to find ways to drive behavior and co-invest. I think the sort of sibling to that is this risk of being siloed geographically. And I was pleased to hear Erwin talk about and make reference to something like clean energy, which, or climate change, which has obvious areas where there are implications. You can think about Miami has a real climate change issue. but you may not think about the climate change issues in Detroit, but they have very, very similar issues in terms of the way water is impacting those cities. So I think trying to really democratize that across communities and not silo geographically where these centers are going to be built is important. And to your point, I think investing in infrastructure and programs that support innovative activity as opposed to investing in specific companies is probably where we get the best outcomes.
Appreciate that. Just a couple more topic areas I want to touch on with you, and then we'll have a couple minutes for some questions if folks want to give that some thought while we're talking up here. You both talked about work, future of work, and that's going to be a big part of what the commission is going to look at over the next year or two. Just any additional thoughts or perspectives on some of the implications from building out of the pandemic, of the remote work opportunity, the lack of geography, of importance of geography, as it were, just some trends as you look out maybe over the next couple of years that, things you sort of are expecting to see or perhaps concerned about what you might see.
I think communities need to prioritize investments in place and quality of life. So because talent can be mobile, the sort of winners and losers, if you will, of areas of growth are going to be the communities that offer the quality of life improvements that give people a chance to spend their incomes and raise their families and engage with their community. Talent is going to be a little more porous, and so I think companies are going to have to think about folks coming and going a little more regularly than they may have before, and moving, maybe working for the company, then moving into something more entrepreneurial, then maybe coming back, that sort of movement back and forth. And then I think communities really need to think about their talent pipeline. I mean, we working on a project in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and partnered with the public school system there. There were two things in this that were important to me. One, that it was a public school, and two, that we weren't just creating another school that was going to take all the best and brightest students, but we created a program that allowed students to sort of stay at their home school and enhance their learning. And so we built this program called the AMP Lab, where we've put a program for 11th and 12th graders within a mixed-use campus that gives them a lab-based curriculum. So there's 4 different labs: a maker lab, an ag lab, a design lab, and a technology lab that allows them to think about entrepreneurial ideas, have some advanced STEAM classes, and then have co-op opportunities with the companies that are based in that campus as well. And those students come there for a half day. So they're at their home high school. They come either in the morning or the afternoon. There's 200 spots in the morning, 200 in the afternoon. We had 1,500 applicants for that program in its first year. So it's, I think, thinking about talent pipeline and thinking about offering students who are really interested and really engaged in accessing what they see as a really exciting job opportunity and career pathways is important. I think communities also need to think about their as we're starting to shift talent and move folks around in a lot of different places. I think we've got a real issue around construction capacity and building these communities. We've really overlooked trade labor and specialty trades, masonry, electrical, et cetera. Particularly if we're going to try to move towards net zero. We do a lot of investing in the UK, and it's very easy to deliver net zero buildings there because we have the infrastructure within the construction industry and within the energy industry to deliver that. It's incredibly difficult to do that in the US without just paying way more than you would for any normal building. And so, the private sector is just not going to get there unless we can build up that infrastructure.
And I think those are all valid points. However, I also think that at the end of the day, this ability to do remote work really helps diversify, the workforce to various communities that normally wouldn't be able to come into that workforce. And then also different communities have different viewpoints about things as well, and they have different sort of historical levels of expertise, which brings a lot of interesting, technologies and the companies and so forth into the mix as well. So I think ultimately, if we can solve all the problems, I think it's a helpful thing.
Steve, that's a great point. I've been thinking a lot about it. It was like 20 years ago that Tom Friedman wrote "The World is Flat," and somewhere along the way we forgot the US is flat. And there really is an opportunity for states to collaborate with each other, for municipalities to collaborate, and for businesses to collaborate across lines very easily. When we do work across different countries, we have multiple people who are telling me what we can and can't do based on the governance and the tax implications and all this stuff. We have exactly 0 people who worry about that when we go between states. And so the ability for the US to increase its competitiveness by allowing more of that flexibility across geography in the US is a competitive advantage over what really just about any other country can offer.
Great. Thank you both for that. Thoughts or questions from folks in the audience? I have more, so I can keep going, but I want to give you guys the opportunity to, if anybody has a question, a comment related to what we've talked about today. Well, while folks are thinking, let me shift gears just a little bit and build on something that was brought up earlier in the day, which is the State Department is a lot more focused on technology in the US and US leadership in various technologies. They've created a new State Department Bureau for Cyberspace and Digital Policy. There's a new special envoy for critical and emerging technologies. As you look at sort of the international and geopolitical environment right now, are there some real priorities in your view that that we should be focused on if you think about technology statecraft as a thing going forward?
Well, I think the supply chain issue, which has sort of really come to light because between COVID and the war in Ukraine, is something that definitely needs to be focused on. The first part, of course, is identifying all of the weaknesses in the supply chain and then coming up with potential solutions. So if a supplier can be moved to another country or to this country, and sort of that kind of focus, I think, would be very important.
Yeah, I think there's, in terms of statecraft, creating sort of a hub and spoke mentality globally, where the US is really viewed as a hub for innovation and technology that can then be spread and partnered globally. We have an investment in a solar energy company in the UK with technology that was created and licensed out of NREL. You think about the State Department's ability to foment and promote partnerships between universities, so that when Manchester University in the UK is thinking about a material science partnership, they're prioritizing that with Purdue instead of Tsinghua. So I think there's a way for the State Department to help grow those international partnerships among researchers, which is going to level up the ability for that innovation to happen. And then somewhat related, and maybe by virtue of the hub and spoke model, where that shining city on the hill is seen globally. Immigration policies really got to be looked at, and that's not so much a State Department issue, but they can support that in many ways. I think that, well, I guess there's a lot of it the State Department issue, but I think, look, we could add, 300,000 people to Baltimore and 500,000 people to Detroit and 600,000 people to St. Louis. And you wouldn't even notice, because the infrastructure is there. Those cities are much larger than the populations that currently inhabit them. And if we can promote immigration for folks who want to work towards a middle-class lifestyle, want to create new businesses, we're still at historically low rates of entrepreneurship when you factor in sort of small business creation, for all the breathless news coverage that technology and life sciences get. That middle-class entrepreneurship and small business formation and creation, which largely historically has been driven by immigrant populations, has been cut off at the knees. And I think our ability to bring more people into this country and have them engage in that innovation framework is, to me, probably the biggest thing that's being overlooked right now.
Fantastic, thank you. So in a few minutes, we're gonna send folks off to breakout sessions. Well, first, we're gonna give you the opportunity to refill your coffee and do a bio break for everyone. But after that, we're gonna jump to breakout sessions, and as I mentioned earlier, there's really 4 big areas that we're gonna be focused on: the transition to clean energy, accelerating the development and deployment of critical technologies, the future of work and the workplace, place-based innovation. as you think of these four areas and the commission's work going forward in the next couple of years, what are one or two of really just the key issues in your minds that you want to make sure is an area of focus? And, from what you've heard so far in the conversation today, are we missing anything? Steve, go ahead.
So from my perspectives, mostly because my experience is focused on the Valley of Death, if you will, it's really working with the government to help bring technologies into the market, not just the development of it. And for the companies that are in our portfolio, for example, even working with national labs comes with a lot of strings attached. For example, there needs to be sharing of your technology then with others, and all sorts of other sort of issues. So finding ways to get the government to be more helpful in getting technologies into the market would be one of the important things for me that I think would be very helpful.
So we're thinking a lot about where we're making investments across the U.S. and a strategy for leveling up regional economies built around these knowledge centers. And a lot of that thinking sort of comes to sort of shallowing out the Valley of Death, because a Valley of Death is important. Some companies need to die. Not every idea is a good one. And so, but we want to make that process a little less dependent on a lack of resources. And so you think about work we've done in Durham, North Carolina. Duke University has over $1 billion of annual research expenditure, and their translation and commercialization outcomes were just pathetic. And one of the things that we saw is that this idea that you couldn't raise $5 or $6 million in seed capital in order to launch and build your lab and get to proof of concept. A lot of it was single molecule biology at the time. And so what we did was brought in flexible lab spaces and allowed people to move into fully built labs, renting by the bench up through full laboratories. And so now you could start a company on a credit card instead of needing to raise all that capital to build it. And we provided the core facilities. And then industry partners came in and wanted to provide equipment, wanted to provide mentoring. And so what it did is just it lowered the barrier of entry to starting a company, but it also sort of shallowed out the Valley of Death and allowed companies to sort of maximize their resources and get a little further. And what we've seen is the companies that are failing, the talent from those companies are immediately going back into another company that's there nearby. So I think as part of that, one of the things that we need to be very focused on is really building and promoting a culture of failure. Creative destruction is important, and I think our economy has had so many interventions of late, some of them very necessary, but a lot of things that should have fallen apart or should have died haven't. And what it does is stifle innovation because it doesn't force people to think differently. It doesn't force talent into a different entrepreneurial idea. And so local and regional economies need to be comfortable with failure and need to accept that as an outcome that is a pathway to success. And then along those lines, I think our work probably can benefit from more direct engagement at the state level and at the local level, because a lot of this can be driven very directly at the municipal level. Mayors tend to be in office for a longer period than congressional. If you think, there's certainly got examples of folks sticking around in Congress a long time, but if you think about where the real impact is, when these dollars really make it down into communities, our ability to work with states and municipalities in driving innovation outcomes is an opportunity for us in this second phase.
And I know in many ways a failure is a badge of honor in the private sector, but can you envision a government that is accepting of failure, or are we just not set up for that, and shouldn't expect it? Because let's go back to the point we're making that we were talking about earlier of these massive investments.
Yeah.
that and what Erwin was talking about is some pretty, for NSF, experimental stuff.
Yeah.
Are we going to be okay with some of this not working out?
Well, not to sound political, unacceptable, but we've spent trillions of dollars on failures at the Department of Defense. And so I think there is a general acceptance of that culturally within government. And I think we use in our company sort of the philosophy from the Blue Angels. What did we say we were going to do? What did we do? And how can we make that better next time? And so I think that there is this opportunity to say that, yeah, not everything has to work out. And I think this goes back to sort of the Solyndra example you used, that when the government goes to try to pick winners and losers, it's just not very efficient. It's not the best use of the talented people who are in government. And so, I think you're going to have a lot easier time accepting failure if what you've invested in is infrastructure and co-investment with the private sector, where the private sector gets to really judge what's successful and what's failure, supported by the federal government into things that the private sector just won't invest in because it won't take some risks. But for the risks that it will take, allowing them to be the judges of that instead of federal government is probably the way to let it happen.
I think that question, as you phrased it, there's not a good, sort of politically correct answer, but I think you've done a great job actually of doing that. So have nothing more to add.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, please join me in thanking our panel for a great discussion.